crucial Allied triumphs in the Pacific have been identified as pivotal moments in the war against the Japanese. Future Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN operations on the scaled during the first 6 months of the war, were severely hampered by the American Navy's sinking of 4 enemy carriers at Midway. Following the first Marine amphibious invasion of that southern Solomon Island on August 7, 1942, the Japanese southeastward strategic advance to cut the sea lanes to the Antipodes was halted by the American land, sea, and air forces' 6-month-long, exhausting Japanese defense and eventual conquest of Guadalcanal. The devastating string of losses the Japanese sustained while attempting to defend New Georgia, Kolombangara, and Bougainville in the central and northern Solomons, however, has gone unnoticed. Given the necessity of imperial forces on the Central Pacific and New Guinea fronts, the losses incurred on these hostile jungle islands, including those of Imperial Japanese Army, IJA units, IJN ships, planes, and crews, could never be replaced. Never had men in the Marine Corps had to fight and maintain themselves over such difficult terrain as was encountered on Bougainville, wrote Major General Alan H. Turnage, commander of the 3rd Marine Division, which had invaded Bougainville in November 1943. The Bougainville jungle was worse than we had found on Guadalcanal, according to Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift, who oversaw the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal, and later the WoW Marine Amphibious Corps, IMAC, for the Bougainville landings. Frankel Stanley, U.S., a historian from the Army's 37th Infantry Division, wrote on the Japanese counteroffensive against the United States. The curtain was about to rise on one of the bloodiest, most fanatical banzai attacks made by the Japanese in the South Pacific War against a civilian army of battling clerks, farmers, mechanics, schoolboys, and businessmen, reads the March 1944 Army's Afghan 11th Corps perimeter at Cape Torokina on Bougainville. Of all the 28 months I spent overseas, nothing compared to Bougainville for miserable living conditions, recalled another Marine veteran who served on Guam and Iwo Jima. The closest thing I have ever seen to a living hell in my life may have been Bougainville. Compared to the mostly forgotten 6-month Marine and Army operations at Cape Torokina on Empress Augusta Bay, the Pacific campaigns that preceded and followed Bougainville, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, the Marshall Islands, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa seem to be far more headline-grabbing amphibious operations. A paradigm shift in Allied strategy in the South Pacific could be one reason for Bougainville's overshadowing. A Japanese intelligence officer acknowledged after the war that the Americans had started to show a new strategic initiative to invade Japanese-held areas where they were the least protected, following the brutal frontal assaults along Papua's northern coast at Buna in late 1942 and early 1943. This was the kind of tactic we detested the most, the officer stated. With little casualties, the Americans struck and took control of a comparatively vulnerable region, built airfields, and then cut off the troops' supplies. Our strong points were progressively starved out without launching a massive operation. In the same way that water seeks out the weakest opening to sink a ship, the Americans flooded into our weak spots and engulfed us. Cutting off and isolating their strong points and, in effect, transforming them into vast jungle prison camps is how historian Stephen Taffei summed up this new tactic. General Douglas MacArthur, the Commander-in-Chief of the Southwest Pacific Area, SWPA, had boldly boasted in May 1942, prior to the start of the battle for Papua, that he could take Rabaul, a Japanese stronghold on the northeastern tip of the island of New Britain in the Bismarck Archipelago, if he had 3 infantry divisions and 2 aircraft carriers. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, JCS, wisely put this grandiose idea on hold. The JCS conducted a study in early June 1943 that came to the exact opposite conclusion. It would be too expensive to invade New Britain directly. Instead, Rabaul should be neutralized. General George C. Marshall, the U.S., the Army Chief of Staff, informed MacArthur that the SWPA commander, in conjunction with Admiral William F., had captured Manus in the Admiralty Islands Group and Wewak on the northeast coast of New Guinea, with the ultimate capture of Kavieng on New Ireland, north of Rabaul, by Bull Halsey's South Pacific Force. He thought that Rabaul could be surrounded and successfully destroyed by American Air Force. Allied planners at the Quebec Conference of the Combined Chiefs of Staff in August 1943 were resolute when MacArthur continued to advocate for a direct invasion of Rabaul, and they established the plan known as Operation Cartwheel to destroy Rabaul. Located about northwest of Bougainville, Rabaul served as the principal supply base and headquarters for the Japanese Southeastern Army and Southeastern Fleet. The 11th Air Fleet was responsible for air assets headquartered in Rabaul. With about 50 aircraft per month flown in from Truk in the Caroline Islands, the IJN continued to bolster its air forces in spite of severe losses. The IJA could raise almost 97,000 soldiers in all of New Britain. In November 1943, the IJA had around 76,000 men to defend the area surrounding Rabaul. There were 4 natural harbors there, including Simpson Harbor, which had first-rate docking facilities that could accommodate ships weighing up to 3,000 tons. According to Admiral Samuel Morrison, if the Allies had tried to attack Fortress Rabaul, the blood that would have flowed would have paled Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa to pale pink. The length of the Solomon Island chain exceeds 500 miles. At 130 miles long and 30 miles wide, Bougainville is the largest island in the group and one of the northernmost. Bougainville's location just over 200 air miles from Rabaul made it strategically significant. In terms of topography, Bougainville had 2 main mountain ranges, the Emperor Range in the north and the Crown Prince Range in the south, which was lower and less rocky. The former had 2 active volcanoes, Mount Balbi, which was over 1,000 feet high, and Mount Bagana. Overland travel was restricted to crude routes into the interior of the impenetrable jungle, with the exception of a few roads in the south that could support wheeled transportation. The 2 most significant island routes were the East-West Trail, which ran northwest from Buin on the southern point to Gazelle Harbor beneath Empress Augusta Bay, and the Numa Numa Trail, which ran southwest from Numa Numa on the northeast coast to Empress Augusta Bay. A key component of Operation Cartwheel would be the invasion of Bougainville and the establishment of airfields there. The last stage of the brutal campaign up the Solomon Island chain was to attack Bougainville. However, Bougainville was heavily garrisoned by the Japanese because of its close proximity to Rabaul. Across from the Shortland Islands, Faisi and Balale, Bougainville served as the headquarters for the Japanese Northern Solomons Defense Force, which had its major base at Buin on the island's southeast tip. Around Buin airstrip on the southern tip of the island, there were 15,000 troops from the IJA 17th Army Headquarters and the IJA 6th Division, the latter of which gained notoriety for crimes committed in China. In the south were other airfields, such as Kara, Keita, and Kahili. In addition to the more than 1,000 Japanese soldiers and Navy Coast Artillery in the Shortland Islands and neighboring Balale Island, which had an IJN-run airstrip, the 8th Fleet of the IJN had several hundred more men on Bougainville. There was an airfield at Bonis, in the island's far northwest, that bordered Buka Passage. Furthermore, the IJN had 1,000 sailors stationed at a seaplane base, while the IJA had 5,000 men garrisoned at the Buka airstrip, which is located directly north of Bougainville. The IJA had only established a tiny infantry garrison at Empress Augusta Bay on the western side of the island. The indigenous Melanesian populace of Bougainville was overwhelmingly pro-Japanese following 15 months of Japanese rule. Since many of the coast watchers had been caught, and those who remained at Luce could not safely move around the island, the Allies were unable to obtain up-to-date intelligence on Japanese movements. The last Allied coast watchers were removed from Bougainville by July 1943. The Japanese were aware that the battle for Bougainville would be more important than the Guadalcanal defeat. In the Solomons, the Japanese also continued to have a clear advantage. Their fighter aircraft had a greater range than American aircraft, despite the fact that they had lost Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto of the Combined Fleet had also been steadily expanding his airfields in the northern Solomons, Vila on Kolombangara, and Munda on New Georgia as staging locations. To conserve the dwindling number of skilled pilots, many of whom had been lost in air combat over Guadalcanal, Japanese planes could be sent from Rabaul to New Georgia, where they could refuel before attacking the American bases at Tulagi and Guadalcanal and returning in the same manner, with emergency airfields available for damaged planes. The American aircraft, particularly the fighters, lacked the range necessary to return to American bases after reaching Rabaul. After the Japanese evacuated Guadalcanal in early February 1943, Yamamoto planned to relaunch his air operations on the island from bases on Rabaul, realizing this logistical advantage. Yamamoto was desperate to take back the strategic initiative and possibly secure another significant triumph since the 1941-1942 Lightning War. A Japanese triumph of this magnitude might yet force the Allies to pursue a negotiated peace and give the Japanese the opportunity to maintain their new Pacific empire. Ironically, American Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters based on Guadalcanal shot down Yamamoto's personal twin-engined Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bomber over the southern tip of Bougainville on April 18, 1943, when he was on a morale-boosting mission to the Northern Solomons. Following Yamamoto's passing, Admiral Menechi Koga assumed command of the combined fleet. On June 30, 1943, Halsey landed on New Georgia to continue his battle in the Central Solomons. However, it took until August 5 to secure Munda airstrip, which led to the evacuation of several Japanese units to Kolombangara 3 days later. August 27th was the last day of New Georgia's cleanup. Halsey had originally intended for the attack on Munda to be followed by the capture of the Vila airfield on Kolombangara. However, it was accurate to assume that the Japanese were well established on the island, with an estimated force of close to 1,000 soldiers. Halsey had no desire for another drawn-out campaign to seize Vila. I was afraid of another slugging match because of the excessive duration of the Munda operation and our losses, but I didn't know how to avoid it, the American admiral said. Bypassing Kolombangara and arriving at Vella La Vella, the northernmost island in the New Georgia group, his crew devised a new route to Bougainville. The 35th Regimental Combat Team of the U.S. Army touched down on Vella La Vella on August 15th. The occupation was finished by September 24th, with the arrival of the 14th New Zealand Brigade the following month. Because Japanese ground forces were both small and in the process of withdrawing, there was never any significant ground combat on Vella La Vella. Instead, the real battle for Vella La Vella was fought by naval surface action and constant aerial attacks on American shipping, including over 1,000 enemy air attacks between August 15th and September 3rd, 1943. In some ways, the defeatism the Japanese experienced following the fall of Guadalcanal and Papua in the early winter of 1943 was reversed by the loss of New Georgia and the avoidance of Kolombangara. Imperial headquarters gave local Japanese commanders orders to hold the Southeast Front for as long as possible on September 30th, 1943. Tokyo issued directives stating that Rabaul must continue to be the focal point of this defensive line. New attacks from the east and south were to be staged in Bougainville. The troops were concentrated on Bougainville as they were evacuated from Kolombangara and the other Central Solomon Islands to safer Japanese territories. Following the evacuation of Kolombangara and the loss of Guadalcanal and New Georgia, Bougainville was considered the most suitable place to achieve the dual objectives of defending Rabaul and acting as a potential base from which to launch another attack toward the southeast. Additionally, Bougainville's sustained occupancy was intended to provide the leaders in Tokyo the time they needed to organize and carry out land offensives in China and across Burma's western border into India. If these efforts are successful, Allied war plans in the Pacific Theater may be derailed. Halsey assigned the Tsetsai Amphibious Corps headquarters under U.S. command in July 1943. Marking the start of American tactical planning for the Bougainville assault. Following Majors General Charles Barrett's untimely death in a tragic fall, Marine Majors General Alexander Vandegrift was appointed to lead the ground forces. In order to help neutralize that significant Japanese base and support the SWPA's planned invasion of Cape Gloucester on the southern end of New Britain between December 25, 1943 and January 1, 1944, MacArthur wanted Halsey's planes within fighter range of Repulse. On November 1, 1943, MacArthur decided that Halsey's South Pacific forces had to take up residence on the Bougainville mainland for strategic reasons. Halsey was given full control of the strategic site for the invasion of Bougainville by MacArthur. Even though the fighting was still going on New Georgia in the Central Solomons, Halsey's intentions for the northward move were altered when the Americans saw that the IJA forces on Bougainville were much more powerful than those on Guadalcanal. Establishing a beachhead on Bougainville without a carnage required a change in the strategic perspective and tactical strategy of Admiral Halsey and his South Pacific Force staff, mostly as a result of American combat fatigue. Only the unblooded 3rd Marine Division and the Army's 37th Infantry Division, which was primarily an Ohio National Guard unit that had also seen action on New Georgia, remained in Halsey's South Pacific Force after the Army's 25th Infantry Division on New Georgia and the 2nd Marine Division's dedication to Nimitz's Central Pacific Offensive. In order to prevent significant losses, Halsey needed a beachhead that could attack a weakly fortified sector. However, since continuous carrier-based air cover would not be available indefinitely to maintain an umbrella over the invasion site, he would need to have enough territory to immediately erect a strong perimeter to safeguard the construction of a coastal fighter airfield. In order for aircraft to take part in Operation Cartwheel, a fighter and medium bomber strip would be constructed as quickly as feasible farther inland, within a well-defended American perimeter. The east coast of Bougainville's Quetta region featured both suitable harbors for Allied cargo and the level plains needed for airfields. But since this location was close to Japanese-occupied Choiseul, it would also be necessary to secure this sizable Solomon Island beforehand. Strong Japanese garrisons centered on the island's southern point at Buin, and the unsuitable soil composition for building airfields were drawbacks to other beaches on Bougainville's east coast. Cape Torokina, near Empress Augusta Bay on the west coast of Bougainville, was an alternate location. It was nearer Repulse than Quetta, and neither powerful garrisons nor nearby enemy-held islands could obstruct its arrival. There, a 5-mile stretch of shoreline was judged acceptable for landing, and the soil characteristics in the area were ideal for establishing airfields. The Cape Torokina region was virtually cut off from the powerful Japanese garrisons in northern and southern Bougainville due to the rough terrain of the Emperor and Crown Prince mountain ranges and the rudimentary jungle routes. After the American invasion force landed at Empress Augusta Bay, Halsey's staff estimated that it would take the Japanese 3 to 4 months to transport enough heavy weaponry over the mountains to initiate counterattacks. The 5-mile stretch of beach was mainly exposed to monsoons, and the bay's inshore waters were dangerous and inadequately mapped. Additionally, the anchorage was unsuitable for large vessels, and the coastline was swampy. Lastly, the Torokina region was just 215 miles from Repulse airdromes to the northwest, and no more than 65 miles from any of the Japanese air bases on Bougainville. In their assessment of the beach regions on Bougainville as possible landing grounds for an Allied amphibious invasion, the staff of the IJA's 17th Army considered the Cape Torokina location at Empress Augusta Bay to be the least plausible. Only one company of 270 soldiers from the 2nd Battalion, 23rd IJA Infantry Regiment, Colonel Hamanue, regimental commander, and 175mm piece of artillery were stationed there by Japanese commanders as an outpost. The commander of the IJA 6th Infantry Division on Bougainville, Lieutenant General Masatane Kanda, had roughly 2,500 soldiers there, and anticipated that the Allies would land southeast of Cape Torokina. General Hitoshi Imamura, who was based in Rabaul, thought Halsey's landing at Cape Torokina would just be a brief amphibious assault. Instead of sending his sizable force to the western coast, Imamura chose to fortify the northern tip of Bougainville because he thought that the Buka Island region, which is located immediately north of Bougainville, would serve as the primary invasion target for Halsey's South Pacific Force. Later, Imamura mysteriously kept bolstering the defenses at Buin even after Halsey's invasion of Cape Torokina, even though the South Pacific Force was still stationed there. Halsey designated the battalions that would make up Bougainville's invasion force on September 22, 1943, and scrapped all of his previous plans for an invasion. The assault at Empress Augusta Bay would be led by the 14,000 soldiers of the newly established 3rd Marine Division, with support from the 3rd Defense Battalion and the 2nd and 3rd Raider Battalions. Despite beach and terrain conditions that the Admiral described as worse than anything ever encountered in the South Pacific, Halsey would push his soldiers ashore at the weakly held Cape Torokina, in stark contrast to the attack on New Georgia and the Central Solomons. With an invasion via Empress Augusta Bay scheduled for November 1st, Halsey notified MacArthur of his landing location at Cape Torokina on October 1st. In an attempt to mislead the Japanese about Halsey's true objective, the 2nd Parachute Battalion of the 1st Marine Parachute Regiment, led by Lieutenant-Colonel Victor H. Krulak, attacked Choiseul on October 27, 1943, which is located north of Vella-la-Vella and southeast of Bougainville. In order to provide advanced bases for small vessels, especially PT boats, Halsey's South Pacific Force would also need to occupy the Treasury Islands, which are located directly south of Bougainville and the Shortland Islands. On October 27th, over 4,000 soldiers from the 8th New Zealand Brigade Group stormed the treasuries, which were only guarded by a few hundred Japanese. However, surprise in the coincident raid on Choiseul would be crucial to keeping the Japanese defenders perplexed as to where to commit their reserves, because the Allied commanders knew that the Japanese had roughly 25,000 troops stationed in the Buin Shortland Islands area at the southern end of Bougainville, with the necessary barges to transport reinforcements to the treasuries. By the end of the first day of the invasion, the Allies had effectively taken control of the Treasury Islands, forcing the small Japanese garrison into the jungle. By now, Halsey would have the advanced bases to support his invasion of Bougainville and the construction of airfields, avoiding the supply crisis he had encountered on Guadalcanal, thanks to the Treasury Islands and the previously taken Vella-la-Vella. On September 24th, the first American aircraft touched down at Vella-la-Vella, giving Halsey access to a second nearby airstrip to support his beachhead at Torokina. The American airport in Vella-la-Vella could handle around 100 planes by mid-October. The island attacks appeared to be having the desired effect for Halsey's staff, as Admiral Koga did not take any decisive action and remained extremely suspicious of an immediate invasion of New Britain, more so than Bougainville, while the Japanese high command in Tokyo continued to be perplexed by these Allied diversions. The Choiseul raid and the occupation of the Treasury Islands were crucial preliminaries to landing on the western coast of Bougainville, acting as a series of short right jabs to throw the enemy off balance and to conceal the real power of our left hook to his belly at Empress Augusta Bay, according to Marine General Roy Geiger, who would succeed Vandegrift as IMAC commander on Bougainville on November 9th. Task Force 31's Bougainville Amphibious Force commander is Rear Admiral Theodore S. Wilkinson. These seasoned leaders, along with Vandegrift and later Geiger, as commanding general, IMAC, would assist in overcoming the intelligence shortcomings of the 3rd Marine Division, reinforced, commanded by Magyar's General Alan Turnage. Due in great part to the delayed selection of the Cape Torokina amphibious landing site, the division's history states that virtually nothing was known of the hydrography, terrain conditions inland from selected beaches, and location of enemy defenses in the immediate area. Vandegrift was concerned that there might be more than the 300 Japanese forces suspected of being in the vicinity, even though he had secured the necessary transport to land his 14,000 Marines. Following the initial landings at Torokina on November 1st, 1943, follow-up convoys would bring in more supplies, and the 21st Marines, 1st Marine Parachute Regiment, and 37th Infantry Division, which included the 129th, 145th, and 148th Infantry Regiments, and was commanded by Maji, Gen. Robert S. Beitler. When Vandegrift's earlier intelligence estimations that only one company of Maji, Mae Satanikonda's 6th Division's IJA 23rd Infantry Regiment would be defending the landing site were confirmed. His fears were quickly allayed. However, the opposition, however small, would put up a strong defense in Torokina because of Tokyo's desire to now tenaciously protect every location. At 6 a.m. on November 1st, Navy dive bombers from Munda, New Georgia, launched a preliminary naval bombardment of Cape Torokina and strafing of the landing beaches, but the Japanese did not respond. After that, assault waves of 3rd Division Marines, the 3rd Marines on the right and the 9th Marines on the left, crossed their slender beaches, which were only 30 to 50 yards deep, to attack the dense forest that surrounded Bougainville. Near Cape Torokina, the 2nd Raider Battalion was positioned between 3rd Marine Regiment battalions. Puruwada Island, located in Empress Augusta Bay northwest of Cape Torokina and next to small Torokina Island in the bay to the east, was captured by elements of the 3rd Raider Battalion. The landing beaches stretched from Cape Torokina to just west of the Koromokina Lagoon, which was fed by a river of the same name. They were about 8,000 yards long. Heavy surf and a high beach prevented many of the 9th Marines' landing craft from properly anchoring on the western, or left flank, beaches, forcing many Marines to wade ashore in deep water to the far left of their assigned assault beaches, despite the fact that the Marines did not come into contact with strong Japanese forces. Vandegrift, the IMAC commander, stopped additional landings along the 9th Marine beaches after more than 80 LCVPs, landing craft vehicle personnel, and LCMs, landing craft mechanized, were disabled. However, the 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, encountered at least 25 entrenched Japanese positions on Cape Torokina, which had only been slightly damaged by the previous naval bombardment to the far right of the assault beaches. Protected by pillboxes and infantry rifle pits on the Cape's northern face, a 75mm artillery piece infiltrated the amphibious assault of the 2nd Raider Battalion, 1st Battalion, and 3rd Marines within 500 yards. The correct landing places of the battalion's companies and headquarters were disturbed by this entrenched 75mm cannon, which struck 14 landing craft, 4 of which sank. The lack of Japanese fortifications made it simpler for the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, 3rd Marines, to land on their beaches. The few enemy men there retreated into the jungle after only minor resistance. Seeing the terrible impact the 75mm gun was having on the beach and on the incoming landing craft, Sergeant Robert A. Owens and his team from A Company, 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, stormed the gun position, which was in a palm wood bunker fortified with gasoline drums filled with sand. Despite being shot by Japanese snipers, Owens went uphill to attack the bunker alone with 4 men in assistance, while other members of his platoon at the base of the slope above the landing place were being killed by sniper fire. Owens killed many members of the artillery crew by crawling through the gun port of the bunker and firing his Thompson submachine rifle. Other Marines killed escaping enemy troops who were leaving via the back of the bunker. Owens passed away from his injuries after collapsing when he too came out of the bunker. If Owens hadn't killed most of the crew, the bunker's large supply of high explosive ammo would have been directed onto the beach and landing craft. For his courage and selflessness, Owens was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. By the afternoon, identical attacks had demolished all the remaining pillboxes, allowing other Marines to either capture the structures from the rear or force hand grenades down the ventilation shafts. Marines engaged the Japanese 23rd Infantry Regiment defenders in hand-to-hand battle in the communication trenches between the pillboxes. Eventually, over half of the regiment's 270 Japanese infantrymen escaped into the bush. There were 180 Marines killed and injured. The 3rd Raider Battalion captured the islands of Puruwada and Torokina with little fatalities. It took several more days to eliminate the snipers. G Company, 9th Marines, was positioned far south of the Laruma River to oppose an enemy movement from the north, while M Company, 3rd Raider Battalion, attached to the 2nd Raider Battalion for the main landing, took up positions on the Mission Trail in case the Japanese approached from the south. The battle for the narrow beachhead was over, but the battle along the jungle perimeter had begun. As American fighters from Vella La Vella and Munda attacked the Aichi D-3A Valdive bombers and Mitsubishi A-6M fighter escorts, which numbered roughly 120 planes that day, Japanese air attacks from Repulse began as soon as the landings began, momentarily halting operations. By the end of November 1st, the 12th Marines' 75mm and 105mm howitzers had been dragged into the perimeter of Bougainville through the mud, and the 3rd Marine Defense Battalion's 90mm anti-aircraft guns had dug in and provided some additional firepower to the 14,000 Marines ashore. Days later, the U.S. A-fighter strip was being built at Cape Torokina, and Navy Seabees started building crude roads. The gunfire ceased. General Turnage repositioned the 3rd and 9th Marines after Marine patrolling failed to locate any significant Japanese formations within 2 miles of the temporary perimeter within a week. With the exception of one company stationed at a roadblock along the Piva Trail, the Purwada and Torokina Island raiders were kept in reserve. On November 6th, elements of the 21st Marines entered the perimeter, and on November 9th, the 148th Infantry Regiment, 37th Division, touched down. The artillery of the 37th Division, as well as its 129th and 145th Regiments, would land in 2 weeks. Similar to Guadalcanal, the Japanese misjudged the strength of the lodgment and were perplexed by the location of Bougainville's invasion. Under the leadership of bespectacled Lieutenant General Harukichi Hayaku Take, the IJA 17th Army Headquarters had abandoned the defensive effort at Torokina, supposing that the main American landing would still take place at Buka in the north or Buin on the southern tip of the island. In order to engage the left of the Marine perimeter and force the commitment of Marine reserves, Hayaku Take received elements of the 53rd and 54th Infantry Regiments of the 17th IJA Division from Rabaul, which landed on Bougainville on November 7th. Meanwhile, the stronger attack from Buin would be launched at the Piva Trail roadblock on the right of the perimeter. To the north of the perimeter, the strong surf dispersed the Japanese landings. The Japanese decided to assault K Company, 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, at the Laruma River right away, rather than waiting to gather their forces. The enemy was forced to go on the defensive just west of the Coromokina River, when this company was instructed to counterattack through a muddy swamp. Company-sized forces of the 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, backed by tanks and 37mm anti-tank pieces, relieved the attacking K Company Marines, who had spent all of their energy trying to drive the Japanese out of their makeshift defensive positions. The company-sized elements demolished some of the enemy emplacements. On November 8th, the following day, the 1st Battalion, 21st Marines launched an attack backed by the artillery of the 12th Marines, while the 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines launched a combined mortar and tank offensive. Japanese resistance was minimal, and American airstrikes close to the mouth of the Laruma River contributed to the approximately 300 enemy deaths at the Battle of the Coromokina, while the Marines sustained over 45 casualties. In the area of the Piva Trail, where 2nd Raider Battalion units blocked the route, a Japanese advance from the south had also been expected. On November 7th, 8th, the IJA 23rd Infantry Regiment, 6th Division, from Buin, launched an offensive in battalion-sized formations. The Marine Raiders, backed by the 9th Marines mortarmen, stopped a Japanese frontal attack that was led by Maj. Gen. Shun Iwasa. On the morning of November 9th, General Turnage, still in need of extending his southern perimeter, sent in the 3rd Raider Battalion via the Piva and Numa trails. After a failed Japanese envelopment, the enemy withdrew through Piva village, which was subsequently captured that day by the 1st and 2nd Battalions, 9th Marines, ending a stalemate that lasted for several hours. The Marines were also now at the intersections of the east-west and Numa trails and the Piva and Numa trails. The Marines could start constructing airfields if they could take control of this intersection and keep the Japanese outside the perimeter. Over 500 Japanese dead were discovered during this battle, while just over 50 Marines were killed and injured. The 2nd Battalion, 21st Marines, advanced past the intersection to establish an outpost on November 13, 1943. The approaching Marines encountered a well-armed, reinforced, company-sized enemy detachment in a coconut grove with robust defensive fortifications because they had not conducted adequate reconnaissance. The terrain caused the Marine Battalion's companies to lose communication with battalion headquarters and with each other. The following morning, the coconut grove was bombarded by artillery and Marine dive bombers, but the Japanese managed to hold their positions. 2 Marine companies launched a frontal assault, aided by 3rd Tank Battalion M3 light tanks, but the offensive was halted by precise Japanese anti-tank fire that ambushed the Marines. The Japanese withdrew eastward along the east-west trail before the end of the day. Although the Marines sustained roughly 60 losses, more than 40 Japanese dead were discovered among the broken barricades. While the 9th Marines tended to the swamp on the right, the 3rd Battalion, 21st Marines, and the 148th and 129th Infantry Regiments, 37th Division, extended the perimeter by roughly 1,000 to 1,500 yards along the center and left. Regretfully, on November 17th, Japanese airstrikes resulted in heavy losses among reinforcements both inside and outside the line. By removing enemy roadblocks on the Numa Numa Trail, which parallels the Piva River's west branch, and the east-west trail, which intersects the former trail, and a tributary of the Piva River's east branch, Marine General Geiger, who is currently in charge of IMAC, aimed to further enlarge the perimeter. In addition, Geiger sought to take control of a portion of the high ground northeast of the beaches of Torquemada. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions, 3rd Marines, successfully launched their attacks on the barricades along the paths on November 19th, 20. On November 21st, a 2nd Battalion Company was assigned to capture a 400 to 500-foot ridge immediately north of the east-west trail that overlooked the branches of the Piva River. The Japanese attempted to recover the ridge, which led to fierce fighting. The ridge, which extended the perimeter to the northeast, was still held by the 3rd Marines following 3 days of Japanese suicide attacks. Other Marine units crossed the Piva River on November 21st as well, moving east for about 1,000 yards before encountering an impassable swamp. On the far left of the perimeter, the 129th Regiment advanced 1,000 yards to the northwest without encountering any resistance. To enable the 3rd Marines to move east of the Piva River branches toward Eagle Creek and the Torquemada River, a massive preliminary Marine and Army artillery and mortar barrage was released 3 days later. Here, the 3rd Marines defeated stiff Japanese resistance and fortifications. Before bogging down in swampland, the Marines had pushed nearly a mile past their target. The Japanese left 10 times as many dead on the shell-pocked battlefield as the Marines, who suffered over 100 casualties during this battle. When work on a bomber airport, Piva Uncle, and a 2nd fighter strip, Piva Yoke, started on November 26th, the effort to capture Torquemada gained impetus. This allowed planes operating from the Central Solomon airfields to arrange their missions to neutralize Repulse. The Seabees started building the coastal fighter airstrip on November 10th and completed it on December 10th. Other geographic features that needed to be taken in order to prevent shelling of the airfields were Hills 500 and 600 along Eagle Creek and Hill 1000, which is located just north of the east-west trail. On November 27th and December 6th, respectively, these were inhabited. The battle was far from over. Elements of the Marines' 1st Parachute Regiment made a delayed attempt to take control of a spur next to Hill 1000 on December 7th, 2 years after Pearl Harbor, but were routed by a reinforced company from the Japanese 23rd Infantry Regiment. The 21st Marines eventually captured this slope after 11 days of brutal fighting for what would be known as Hellzapoppin Ridge. Other 21st Marines forces pushed the enemy off Hill 600A, which was also close to the Torquemada River on December 21st. However, the enemy relentlessly retaliated, requiring 3 more days of fierce fighting before the Japanese were driven into the jungle and off the hill. The Marines on Bougainville, aided by the 37th Infantry Division, had broken through the jungle of this northern Solomon Island more than 22,000 yards from the narrow beaches that had been stormed more than 7 weeks prior, but their combat mission was ended by the Americans' actions to secure the few heights above the jungle floor. Major General Oscar W. Griswold, who currently commands the U.S., took over General Geiger's IMAC command, a 1/3 Corps of the Army. The majority of the 3rd Marine Division was replaced by the American 23rd Division, which was commanded by Major General John R. Hodge. The 3rd Marine Division left Bougainville on Christmas Day after suffering over 400 casualties and 1,400 injuries. On December 28, 1943, the 9th Marines, and on January 9, 1944, the 21st Marines departed the island. As evidence of the Japanese Bushido Code's suicidal tenacity, only 25 of the Japanese enemy had been taken, while Hyakutake's forces had 2,500 dead accounted for on the battlefield. General Hyakutake thought there were only 2,000 U.S. soldiers, which was an underestimate of their strength. Torokina Army forces. He had intended to launch a full-scale counteroffensive against the United States prior to his defeat. Army 14th Corps in early March 1944, mainly alongside the 17th Army's IJA 6th Division and other units. Hyakutake did gather between 15,000 and 19,000 infantrymen, along with 105mm and 150mm weapons and 75mm pack howitzers, which were dragged onto the perimeter's dominant ridges. To protect his bases at Buka and Buin, he decided to keep the remaining 18,000 soldiers from the 17th Army. The 23,000-yard defensive zone of the 14th Corps is bristling with trenches, rifle pits, mortar pits, pillboxes, and reserve positions in depth. The phrase perimeter understates this fact, with pre-registered 75mm pack howitzer companies, 105mm and 155mm howitzer battalions, 150mm long tom cannons, and 90mm anti-aircraft batteries to unleash high-explosive shells on Japanese targets. The 54 Corps' artillery was as powerful. The 54 Corps' regiments were arranged as follows. The 148th, 129th, and 145th of the 37th Division moved on to the 164th, 182nd, and 192nd of the American Division from the perimeter's left, south of the Laruma River, to its right, just astride the Torokina River. The American Division zone included the fighter strip on the beach at Cape Torokina, while the 37th Division's part included Piva Yoke and Piva Uncle. The commander of the 12,000-man 6th Division, Lieutenant General Kanda, chose to divide his forces into 3 groups, Iwasa, Muda, and Magata, each named for its leader, for his counterattack on March 7th. Because it was thought that the Americans would be routed in that time, the Japanese infantrymen only brought 2 weeks' worth of supplies into the fight. A huge enemy artillery barrage that targeted the Piva airfields at dawn the following day forced the evacuation of the Allied aircraft to Munda on New Georgia after Japanese infiltrators started severing the bands of American concertina wire on March 7, 1944. The Japanese artillery positions were hit by the Americans' precise and powerful counter-battery fire. In order to climb the steep slopes of Hill 700, Japanese forces led by Maja, General Shun Iwasa, the Iwasa unit, launched the attack on March 9th just after midnight, moving south toward the heart of the perimeter. More than 4,000 soldiers from the 13th and 23rd Infantry Regiments made up this group. After entering the territory of the 145th Infantry Regiment, its objective was to take control of the 2 airfields, Piva Yoke and Piva Uncle. Early in the morning, Japanese infantry battalions managed to break through the wire using Bangalore torpedoes, taking numerous American pillboxes. This created a 150-yard wide penetration, to which Beitler, the commanding general of the 37th Division, quickly responded. Most of the pillboxes were finally taken back by companies from the 1st Battalion, 145th Infantry Regiment, the division's reserve. Following intense fighting, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 145th Infantry Regiment launched more American counterattacks on March 10th that significantly diminished the enemy salient. Iwasa began a pointless hour-long, battalion-sized banzai attack up the steep slope of Hill 700 as dawn broke on March 11th. 37mm canister fire into their massed formation was a major factor in its horrifying casualties. After the 2nd Battalion, the 148th Infantry Regiment destroyed the whole enemy salient, and collected knowledge on Japanese unit placements and plans for the full counteroffensive from the corpse of a Japanese officer, Iwasa pulled his shattered force 2 miles from the battlefield on March 12th. More than 1,300 infantrymen from the remaining 13th Infantry Regiment, along with engineers, were part of Colonel Toyohari Muta's squad, which was tasked with attacking Hill 260 in front of the American 162nd Infantry Regiment on March 10th. The Muta unit was to guard the bigger Iwasa unit's left flank when the Furtov Corps perimeter was breached, according to the Japanese commander's plan. The Japanese captured a 150-foot banyan tree that served as an observation post from 80 Americans in an artillery observation unit after sending 2 companies of their 13th Infantry Regiment onto the hill's south knob. The north knob was where the GIs ran to. Elements of the 182nd Infantry Regiment attempted, but failed, to retake the south knob for 2 days. The 182nd Infantry attempted an abortive attack on the Japanese positions on the South Knob from the west and northwest on March 12th, which the American Division dubbed Bloody Sunday. 3 days later, Griswold stopped the attacks after determining that the enemy's existing strength was insufficient to threaten his perimeter. On March 17th, American artillery fire eventually brought down the banyan tree observation station. According to Hyakutake's intricate plan, on March 9th and 10th, respectively, the Iwasa and Muta units would commit 13th of Corps' reserves to perimeter penetrations. Beitler, however, was able to prevent the next planned Japanese attack site on the American perimeter from depleting his unit strength since he was aware of the Japanese plan. The precision of a 13th Foreign Corps' own artillery fire was significantly improved by knowledge of the Japanese artillery deployments gained from the documents that were taken. The Magata unit, a 4,300-man unit named for its commander, Colonel Isashi Magata, would launch an attack at dawn on March 12th. The Magata unit, primarily composed of infantrymen from the strengthened IJA 45th Infantry Regiment and backed by mortar and artillery barrages, would be launched along a logging trail that ran parallel to the Numa Trail. It would strike the low area west of Hill 700 in the sector of the perimeter, occupied by the 129th Infantry Regiment. Following their respective breakthroughs, Hyakutake's plan called for the Iwasa and Magata units to converge in order to seize the 2 Piva airfields. After that, the 3 units were to unite and head south to the fighter strip along the coast. The 2nd Battalion, 129th Infantry Regiment, was the target of the Magata unit's 100-yard frontal assault. Before a counterattack by C and G companies of the 1st Battalion, the 129th, acting as a reserve, regained a few of the positions and halted another enemy assault later that day. The Japanese breached an initial defense line and captured a few American pillboxes. Bajitler personally retaliated with Sherman tanks from 1st Corps Reserve and, together with his men, regained his previous lines when the Japanese launched another attack at daybreak on March 13th. Although they were inconclusive, Japanese pre-dawn strikes on March 15th and March 17th made slight inroads into the perimeter of the 37th Division. In order to replenish the losses of his own 45th Regiment, Magata assembled a force of over 5,000 infantrymen by combining elements of the Iwasa and Muta units, following a 4-day break in Japanese attacks from March 1822. Late on March 23rd, Mugata then launched an assault on the perimeter sector of the 129th Infantry Regiment, which is adjacent to Cox Creek. A wireless transmission from 17th Army Headquarters to Tokyo that identified the attack's time and location was intercepted, giving the Americans another warning. On the morning of March 24th, Beitler launched a counterattack using soldiers, tanks, and anti-tank guns in response to a minor Japanese penetration close to the command post of the 2nd Battalion, 129th Soldiers Regiment. The enemy salient had diminished by midday. Fosse Corps artillery barraged enemy unit concentrations with nearly 15,000 rounds as the Japanese withdrew. The counterattack by the Japanese was repulsed, General Hitoshi Imamura, the commanding general of the IJA 8th Area Army, gave Hyakutake permission to leave, and on March 28, 1944, the last members of his army started to leave. Magata's 1,500 survivors traveled north along the Numa Numa Trail, while the Iwasa and Muda units retreated south to Buin. Over 8,500 Japanese were killed and injured during the 19-day enemy counteroffensive, according to battlefield figures. The fact that the 44th Corps suffered 263 fatalities was far lower than the enemy's, which is evidence of the Americans' well-defended positions, interior lines, and expert command of reserves, tanks, and artillery. In this mostly forgotten conflict in northern Solomon, Admiral Morrison wrote, Canada's 6th IJA Division forces could have captured the perimeter and the Torokina Airdrome, wiping out the gains of the Bougainville campaign and raising new hopes at Rabaul, if not for the National Guardsmen of the 37th and Americal Divisions. While the American soldiers within a slightly expanded perimeter just patrolled aggressively and contained them in a vast jungle prison camp, the once powerful 17th Army would be isolated and forced to produce crops and gardens for food. 3 airfields were also built inside the perimeter, and these sites ultimately played a significant role in Operation Cartwheel's removal of Rabaul as a critical component of subsequent South Pacific operations. You have literally succeeded in setting up and opening for business a shop in the Japs' front yard, said Admiral Halsey as he saluted his troops. Unfortunately, memories of the fights for Bougainville faded over time. However, Bougainville made it possible to set up a robust perimeter that was valiantly defended from suicidal Japanese infantry attacks by both Marines and soldiers.